Good morning, and you're welcome to today's Signpost webinar. We hope you're keeping safe and well. Today, we're going to be discussing water quality and how researchers, economists, and behavioural scientists are working with agricultural advisors and farmers to develop new approaches to protecting water quality. The WaterMARKE project is a cross-agency collaboration focused on mitigating agricultural impacts through research and knowledge exchange. And this morning, we're delighted to be joined by Dr. Mary Ryan, who's an environmental economics researcher with Teagasc and also coordinator of the WaterMARKE project. Dr. Paula Cullen, who's a postdoctoral researcher with the WaterMARKE project. Professor Cathal of University of Galway. And finally, we also have Daniel Urban, who's a Walsh scholar and PhD student in University of Galway. So you're all very welcome to this morning's webinar. Mary, you're going to be leading the charge with the presentation. But before we do that, maybe you could give us a little background to the WaterMARKE project.
Sure, Mark, and thanks for the opportunity to present here this morning. It's going to be a fairly high-level whistle-stop tour of the work that we're doing in the project. It's an EPA and Department of Agriculture funded project. It's now in its fourth year, so we reckoned it was timely to present some high-level results. We still have a bit to go in the project, but as you said—
How long is the project altogether, Mary?
4 years.
4 years.
So it's in the fourth year now, yeah.
Okay.
It's about, as you said, bringing the science, the economics, and the behavioural psychology together and working very much with farmers, particularly in the ASSAP programme, to look at coming up with localised solutions for local water quality issues. Without further ado, I'll start into the slideshow and I can start to explain some more about the project then. So you can see from the first slide there that—
Mary, just before we go straight into slides, I just want to remind everybody that if they do have a question, please use the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen. And if you have your questions directed at one particular, because we have a number of presenters this morning, you might want to put the name of the person that you want us to ask the question of. So Mary, thanks again, and remind everybody that this morning's session is being recorded and will be available on the Teagasc YouTube channel and website. So Mary, I'll hand over to you.
Sorry, Mark, for jumping the gun there.
No worries, no worries.
You can
raring
see,
to go.
Thank you, yeah. You're raring to get finished. You can see that from the first slide there, it's a cast of thousands, as is the case in many projects. And there are just 3 presenters here today. And just to point out that the work that we're presenting includes the work of a number of different people, and they'll be mentioned on the slides as well. So in terms of the context where we are now, just a week ago or so, we got the latest EPA water quality report, which shows that we're a long way from meeting the targets of having good quality water by 2027. If you look at the blue and the green segments there, they add up to 54%, and that's for high and good water quality, but we need to be at 100% by 2027. And the EPA also remind us that agriculture is a significant pressure on water quality in Ireland. So that's kind of the high level need for the work that we're doing. Water quality is a peculiarly complex and challenging issue in that it's very, very localized. The nutrient and sediment losses are context specific. And what this means that in any given location, there are interactions between activity, which could be agriculture or forestry or septic tanks, the local hydrology, the soils, the weather, the slopes. All of these factors have an impact on how agriculture affects water quality. So there's spatial, from a research perspective, we say that there's spatial variation, but there's also temporal variation. So these factors change over time. They're not static. They change year on year, depending on changes in activity and weather patterns. And then to make it more complex, nutrient losses are largely diffuse. So it's very difficult to link pollution outcomes directly to the inputs. And we have particular problems in that there's a lag between the polluting event and the resulting pollution. But also from the type of work that we're doing and the type of work that a programme like ASSAP is doing, there's also a lag between a mitigation activity and the resulting remediation. So all these factors have to be taken into account. And this is a very busy slide, but I'm going to talk you through it very quickly, bit by bit. If we start down at the bottom left-hand corner, we look at an innovation system. And what that simply means is we need to look at all the different people, organizations within agriculture or the agri-environment who can influence water quality mitigation. And that was the first element of the project. Top left, we have risk assessment. And this is where the scientists looked at coming up with risk assessments for PLOS in particular. And then we do a whole component of spatial work within the project, where we take GIS data and EPA models, and UTing has come up with very neat GIS modeling methodologies that allow us to look at the activity in catchments and the water quality and see, can we decide what's impacting on water quality within particular catchments. Daniel then has done a lot of work on the cost effectiveness, and this feeds into the GIS work, because he's looking at cost effectiveness at a spatial scale, in other words, at an electoral district or a small area spatial localized scale. Then if we move on to ASSAP, we look at, with all the measures that are applied or that ASSAP advisors propose to farmers, we're trying to see of those measures, what are the characteristics of those measures? What are the costs? What's the ease of use like? What's the farmer acceptance like? Denis and his colleagues in University of Galway in the behavioural psychology component, they're interviewing farmers and advisors to see what can we glean from their interaction with ASSAP and with trying to improve water quality. And then we also look at win-win measures for water quality and see what are the components there, and what we're trying to come up with at the end of the day, and working very much with Noel, and Paula is doing this work at the moment, trying to look at, take the measures in general from ASSAP and see what are the components that we could use to see what are the measures that are easiest and have the most impact for farmers, so that we can try to generalize some of the very specialized information that's coming from ASSAP. And then Cathal, who's involved in all of these different elements, his big thing is to integrate all of this to have economic, scientific and behavioral outputs from the project. So that's the hard part. It gets much easier after this. So in terms of the biophysical risk, Karen Daly and her team looked at pilot farms to come up with the risks for PLOS assessment. And they devised an actual risk assessment and the associated measures to mitigate these risks. And they have published this information, but they have also then, which is critical within our project, they've spent a lot of time training up advisors and upskilling advisors on the implementation, on the risk assessment methodology itself, and the training up of advisors. So in terms of looking at the innovation system, what we want to see is who can influence water quality. First of all, it's farmers, and they're the closest to the streams and the rivers, but there isn't one type of farmer. There are intensive and extensive farmers. But also there isn't just one context, and we saw already that water quality is context specific, and there are areas that are high risk and there are areas that are low risk. So you could have intensive farmers in high risk areas or low risk areas, but the same incentives aren't going to work for these types of farmers. So already we started with 2 different types of farmers who might react to 2 different types of incentives. Now we have 4 different types of risk and incentives. And what are the incentives that are out there? There are many different types of incentives. They're political and social. They're markets and subsidies and premiums, and national policy, local monitoring and enforcement by the local authorities. But then there are also national rules and regulations like the Nitrates Directive and CAP and cross compliance. And there's national level information in terms of research, and there's also national level advice. And there are lots of different actors who are providing these incentives. And I suppose the big message to take away from something like this is that to influence the actors on the right-hand side, so to influence farmers, you also need to be able to look at all these different bodies and to influence how these bodies provide incentives or provide regulation in a way that they can be taken up in the best way possible by the farmers. So working with ASSAP then, we can look at many different things, and I have to say that working with ASSAP has been an absolute pleasure, because the guys in ASSAP and the girls in ASSAP have collected a huge amount of data on an ongoing basis, and it gives a project like ours a lot of information to work with and a lot of nice people to work with as well. So we look at, and Paula will talk to you about the measures, the farm and farmer characteristics. So what farmers adopt measures quickly, what farmers don't. And then Denis and his team looked at the psychology of interaction with ASSAP and water quality. And Cathal then will finally tell you more about the behavioural analysis that we're doing with ASSAP at the moment. And I'll hand you over to Paula, who's the postdoc working on the project at the moment.
Okay, so my role in WaterMARKE is with the help of Noel, is to analyse the measures that ASSAP advisors recommend to farmers. These measures focus on about 44 different environmental issues that impact water quality. The issues are then classified by type, so farmyard, land management, or nutrient management. And there are around 90 different actions that might be recommended, resulting in about 300 measure issue combinations. Each of these measures has been characterized by a number of different features. Based on expert opinion, we've ranked these. So this includes the knowledge level required to undertake the measure, the level of costs involved, both the direct costs that are upfront or ongoing, as well as indirect costs such as lost productivity and transaction costs, i.e. the hassle or admin time. How each of these measures fits with social norms is also collected, so meaning whether it aligns to conventions of both farmers and advisors. And finally, the environmental impact of each measure was estimated. This graph gives an example of some of the data. So each of the measures is ranked on a scale of 1 to 3. The left 3 are for farmer norms, with a higher value meaning that it more closely aligns with what farmers would perceive as the usual way of farming. So the orange and brown there means it is like the way that they would usually farm. And we can see that measures assigned to help farmyard issues are more aligned to the norms. The right 3 show the level of knowledge required, with 3, or brown in the diagram, being higher. A larger amount of the measures indicate a medium to high level of knowledge required. The level of different costs was also estimated on a scale of 1 to 3 for each measure. We can see there is variation across types. While not all measures have ongoing costs, the second column there, most measures have transaction costs, such as hassle admin. This work is at an early stage, and the overall goal is to identify a group of measures that fit norms and have relatively low costs compared to the level of environmental impact achieved. And this will hopefully be done through the clustering of measures. This will have the benefit of being able to prioritize the identified group of measures, and in turn be able to prioritize general advisor and farmer training to measures that would have high uptake and high impact. So my work builds upon that's already completed in WaterMARKE, looking at farmer uptake and completion of measures and recommended to farmers in ASSAP. Some key takeaways from this analysis were that farms in high and medium risk areas are less likely to have started measures than those in low risk areas. Also, catchments with diffuse PN and sediment losses are less likely to have engaged than those with point source losses, who were more likely to have engaged, started and completed measures. Farm characteristics were also analysed, and the results indicated that livestock systems were less likely than tillage farmers to have started measures. Additionally, agri-environment scheme participants were more likely to start and complete measures than non-participants. Another area of analysis in the WaterMARKE project has been completed by Daniel Urban, a PhD student with the University of Galway in Stroke. He's been looking at the cost effectiveness of nitrogen mitigation measures and identifying how it varies spatially. For each electoral district, Daniel has calculated for a range of measures the marginal abatement cost, or cost per unit of emissions abated. This is determined by looking at predicted changes in output and costs over the change in emissions. So, for example, we have wind measures, such as an increase in the dairy breeding index, which would result in a savings per unit abated, represented by green in the map on the left. By comparison, a win-lose measure, such as increasing slurry storage efficiency, where for each unit of emission reduced, there is a cost, signified by orange and red and yellow in the map on the right. These two maps showing a reduction in chemical fertilizer by 10 and 20% show how useful this approach can be in showing the spatial variation of marginal abatement cost, with the map on the left showing variation from savings to cost depending on the area. We can also see the improvement in the marginal abatement cost for most areas under a 20% reduction over the 10%, which shows that it is also useful for comparing measures. Daniel's work, when combined with the behavioural and environmental spatial modelling, that also took place in WaterMARKE, which Cathal will be talking about soon, can aid in identifying a cost-effective combination of measures. And I'll now pass on to Cathal.
Thanks, Paula. Might put the next slide, please. Good morning. So this slide describes the number of. Sorry, the previous slide, please.
Sorry, is this one? Which slide, Cathal?
The Cathal number, please.
Sorry.
That's it. So this slide describes the Cathal numbers over time. So the number of animals is one of the key drivers of water lines. The top line, the blue line, is the total number of cattle, and we see the numbers on the right. And in the June statistics, there were about 7.4 million cattle in the country. And it's a little bit less than the highest number ever that occurred in 1998 after the McSharry reforms. This is driven by the bottom two lines, which are the number of dairy cows in grey and the number of sucker cows in yellow, where post dairy expansion, the number of dairy cows has decreased. It's decreased at a lower rate than the number of dairy cows has increased, and hence we've seen a rise in the number of animals in the country since 2011. Next slide, please. So Yuting Meng, our postdoc, worked with us on analysing the EPA water quality data, and this graphic describes the trend in the various different characteristics. Because the biggest change we see is the fall in high status, so really good quality water over time. That particularly happened back in the 70s. On the other hand, the share of bad water quality has also declined, and over time the share of good water quality status increased. But we see a turning point in 2011. Where the share of areas with good water quality status has declined. Next slide, please. Another thing we're interested in is the mobility of these water quality values. It isn't the case that that all areas stay the same, or when they make a change, they stay the same after that. There's quite a lot of entry and exit, natural variation, and we see that can be reduced due to weather or other local conditions. So over time, we see about 40% the dark bar exit, and a rising and about 20% enter. So the problem here is that more areas have exited high water quality status than enter, but it's relevant to highlight that there is natural variation, and one might consider more frequent water quality monitoring in sensitive areas, given this natural variation, to understand the drivers. It's one of the reasons why the Teagasc Catchment Programme has close to real-time monitoring of water quality to capture this natural variation. Next slide, please. We assembled a very substantial spatial database linking water quality and economic activity, including upstream activity, settlement patterns, waste management, and so on. We published a number of papers on this topic. We find that there is a clear link, unsurprising, between animals and fertilizer and waste on water quality, and there's other drivers as well, which we won't go through here. But one of the key messages we find is that for a given amount of animals, the relationship of water quality has improved over time. There has been very substantial investment, very substantial practice changes and regulation changes over time, that they have had a statistically significant impact over time. But the amount of animals in the system has varied. And so in the period between 2000 and 2010, we saw improvement in water quality due to both improved relationship between activity and water quality and a falling number of animals. But since 2010, we've seen a continued improvement in the relationship between agriculture and water quality because of ongoing measures, but that the increase in the number of animals has increased at a faster rate than we might call that environmental efficiency has improved. And so it's quite similar to climate change, where we've seen improved or less carbon per unit output, but there's more animals, and so there's more emissions. So it's quite a similar issue as in between water quality and climate change. Next slide, please. This is a very busy looking graphic or map. With our spatial data, we can dig down to local areas. And this is a map of, in blue, the areas that maintained high status, green entered, yellow fluctuated, and red exit. And no matter what type of analysis we looked at, we found very localized trends and also very localized drivers of the trends. So the local situation is very important. That is the main conclusion from this. Next slide, please. So from a planning point of view, from an economic point of view, if you think in terms of national solutions, like having a single nitrate zone, to a local problem where the issues are very localized, then one may have a so the water quality issues are not solved because the regulations are too weak. If you have a national, if you have low regulations, if you have high regulations, then and targeting the lowest common denominator, the areas that with the highest need in terms of water quality, then you may find you impose too high a cost on areas that don't need it. So the conclusion really here is from the analysis is that local problems require local solutions. So we need to try to nuance our regulations, our practices, our advice to the local situation, which requires local information. Next slide, please. We did a lot of work on behavior in various dimensions. And we saw earlier a map highlighting win-wins, and it's a very strong message from the Teagasc MAC curve for climate change, and also a strong message from water quality-based MACs, that there are opportunities for farmers to both have benefits for the environment and to improve their profitability. The question is, if win-wins exist, why aren't they already in practice? Why don't people do it already? And so some of the reasons, information failures, they might know about it, that profitability isn't the only driver, that sometimes measures take too much time, there might be too much hassle, or they aren't consistent what people have always done. It requires a change, and for all of us, it's hard to make changes, even if it's in our best interest. There might also be risk attitudes. We see this Rogers on the right about different types of adopters. Early adopters who are taking risks, they want to try new things. Mainstream who kind of wait to see what other people will do before they make a decision, and then late adopters who may never make a change. And so in terms of planning, we need to try to get these early adopters moving to build norms for the adoption of new policies, because farmers, we learn from other farmers before the mainstream will engage. Next slide, please. Other issues might be insufficient skills, so training is important, or capital constraints. If you have to invest, you may not be able to afford it now, or might be able to borrow. And there's also uncertainty about outcomes before you engage, given that very localized, including farm-specific impacts of changes. Next slide, please. So Denis O'Hora, Domenico and Jenny McSharry, colleagues of mine from the psychology school in Galway, did qualitative field work where they had case study, small group discussions with farmers and advisors, and they have a lot of very interesting conclusions. At that level, you can really dig down into the detail of issues that concern different stakeholders. And I guess a consistent issue between both farmers and advisors is the need for practical support. We're looking for people to make changes, both farmers and advisors. And so to be given the time and the resources to be able to do that. A very strong message is that both groups value each other, they respect each other, and they value the input of each other. And some particular issues, high-level issues that have come out, is that farmers are influenced by peers. There's a very strong message across all knowledge, technology transfer and adoption. That in the area of water quality, farmers feel quite isolated and ill-equipped to make changes. And that advisors feel constrained by organizational structures. So this goes back to Mary's original point about thinking about the whole system and not just about the farmers, and some very, very interesting lessons in this research to facilitate organizational change. Next slide, please. We also analyzed a survey that was collected on farms, where we looked at a range of different measures. These are 5 measures: nutrient management planning, soil testing, avoid spreading, fencing, water courses, lime application. So on-farm measures that would improve water quality. And we looked at the behavioural drivers, the beliefs and attitudes, the personal attitudes of farmers, social norms, the influence of peers, knowledge or know-how, and the importance of resources. And across all the measures, we find that norms are really important, the influence of peers, and know-how or knowledge, is consistently strong across measures. So the importance of learning from other farmers and providing knowledge to farmers, that farmers who feel they know enough are likely to engage, because most people want to do their best. We find for resources, we find a conflicting story. We find different relationship between measures that have a win-win, that benefit the farmer and the environment, versus those that have a win-lose. And so we need to perhaps nuance the financial incentives for measures that involve win-lose. So that's a key lesson from that. Next slide, please. This large graph is our map of the way in which research translates into farm advice. So Teagasc has production research, environmental research. There are specialists on both sides. There are frontline advisors, enterprise, business and technology, environment, and also private advisors. And environmental working groups in Teagasc bring both the advice and the research together to help knowledge transfer. Historically, enterprise advisors focus on intensive farmers and environmental on extensive reps farmers. But we heard about the ASSAP program, focusing on areas with the highest need. And so they're specialist advisors who understand the complexity that Paula was talking about. And so the challenge in the future is to mainstream. And that would pose, sorry, next slide, please. Yeah, so the challenge there is to train mainstream advisors to be able to incorporate water quality advice And so the need for in-service training, decision support tools, facts and guides, fact books and guides to help mainstream advisors to translate that specialist knowledge of ASSAP advisors. Next slide, please. So it's my final slide. In summary, we for local solutions for localized problems requires local solutions, information, incentives. We have to take a system perspective, not only see it as a farmer's need to change behavior, we all need to change our behavior to change the incentives that farmers face. To make local decisions, we need more localized activity and scientific data. But we need to bear in mind that there is a cost of doing this. And so there is a balance to be struck between a more national incentives and knowledge and localized knowledge to support those local solutions for local problems. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Cathal and Mary and Paula. Excellent presentation. Really enjoyed those slides. Really gives a good insight into the work that you're doing around water quality. Cathal, you presented some interesting graphs there around the trends in cattle numbers. I'm sure a lot of our viewers this morning would be very interested in the relationships there between cattle numbers and like you talked about, the environmental efficiency. And if I have it right, you're talking about similar to the, let's say, the carbon footprint of an animal, that the water footprint or environmental efficiency is improving, but that is probably being cancelled out to some degree by increases in numbers. Is that
that's
fair
correct
assessment?
That's correct. So before 2010, we saw both going in the same direction. There was an improved footprint, and there were fewer animal numbers. There was a decline. We might remember from that earlier graph. But post 2011, because the animal numbers started to increase before milk quota was abolished, as people geared up, and I think there was some loosening of the quotas after the CAP health check. So even though there's continued improvement, we see that when we look at the water quality relative to number of animals in a catchment, it's the number of animals and growing at a faster rate than the improvements. And as a result, we see a worsening water quality in that period since 2011.
Mary, I'm particularly interested in your slides around that systems approach or the innovation system and the need for everybody to be on the same page, all of the different agencies and influencers. And this is something we're very interested in from a Teagasc Connected perspective. Any recommendations coming from that work?
I suppose one of the things is that the recognition that everybody within the innovation system has a part to play in finding the solution, and also the connectedness of everybody within the innovation system is really important. We found out at the very beginning of the project, one of the first things that we did was brought everybody that you see on that map into a room together. And that was, when was it, July 2018 or something. And even though we'll say ASSAP and LawPro, water quality was becoming way more high profile, some and many of the people in the room had never actually sat down together in a room to discuss what the issues were and how they could all contribute and network with each other to finding better solutions. And that was one of the first things that we did in the project, and we took on board all of their suggestions then in trying to refine what we were doing throughout the project. But that, I suppose, that was a key learning to us and to the people sitting around the big table that day as well.
If I had a question, I have a question for Paula in relation to the knowledge required to implement different measures. I'm interested, Paula, to understand how you assess that. Was there expert input there? How did you assess that based on the different measures?
Yes, so all of the rankings from 1 to 3 were done by an expert, and we will in the future also validate that with further experts to look at it. But yeah.
Great. Thanks, Paula. So we've lots of questions coming through, and do please keep your questions coming through to us. If you have a question for one of our specific one for speakers, please do put that person's name. But just before we go to the audience questions, I do have one more question, Cathal, in relation to those trends that you were presenting. And there was a significant drop in water quality, or I think it was river water quality, that you were showing from around 2010, if I'm not mistaken. There was a dip there. Is there any linkages with any other trends that we know that has caused that outside of agriculture or agricultural?
We do look at economic changes and changes in terms of settlement patterns, but that's probably the biggest single land use change in that period. The agriculture expansion post, that is, my sense is that is the biggest driver. The water quality has not worsened at the same rate as the animal numbers gone up, reflecting the improved relationship between animals. I mean, I think that's an important message, that it's not that nothing has been done. There's been quite a significant impact on what's been happening on farms.
Yeah, it was 2015, wasn't it, when the quota regime was abolished? If I'm not mistaken, there wasn't quite a direct relationship there.
Sorry, I missed that, Mark.
Sorry, I was just talking about the abolition of the quotas, Cathal. That was 2015, if I remember correctly. So there isn't any distinct relationship there. Maybe that's at a too national or general level. Just interested in your thoughts on that. Is there a connection there?
Well, the animal numbers started to grow. 2011 was the lowest year. So there was a decline after the financial crisis, and then there was a build-up of stock in advance of the quota being abolished. So the animal numbers were rising from 2011. Okay. A lot of the growth actually happened before 2015.
Okay. Great. Noel, we have some excellent questions coming through from our viewers. If you want to.
Yeah, absolutely, some really good ones, and as Mark says, keep them coming. Couple of questions, kind of, I'm going to group them together around the increasing of stock numbers and the impact on water quality. And I suppose, Mary, at the very start, you kind of outlined the parameters or the things that influence water quality. Maybe could you maybe delve into that a little bit deeper and explain why those multiple factors are important with regards to water quality impacts, not just intensity?
So things like the environment, is that what you mean, Noel? Yeah, sure.
Yeah, the hydrology and so on.
Yeah, sure. So what you have is, we'll say, you might have a farm that's on light sandy soils. If you do, and you're highly stocked, there's a high risk of loss of nutrients down through the soil into groundwater, because it can move downwards so quickly. The opposite of that then is if you're in the west of Ireland in soils with kind of semi-peaty or with a peaty layer on top of the soil, where you have a high water table and you have high rainfall, on that type of farm, you're at a high risk of pea loss. Because if you spread organic manure or pea on the land, and then you have high rainfall afterwards, and the soil is already saturated, there's no place for the nutrients and sediment to go except to get washed into the nearest drain and into the nearest river. And the thing is that, farmers, they have no control over the environment in which they farm, so they have to deal with it as best they can. And the farmers in those two situations could be at high risk of loss of either N or P, whereas maybe neighbours of theirs are not too far away, could be in different type of soils, and may not be at the same level of risk at all. And, to use common parlance, you could have a guy who's a messer, but it's his messing on the farm isn't going to cause a huge problem. Whereas you could have a very conscientious farmer who's doing his absolute best or her best to manage the soil and the location as well as possible. But because of the soil and the hydrology, or how quickly nutrients can leach down into groundwater, it's largely outside of their control. And as well as that, then Sometimes it can take a long time for nitrates to get down to groundwater. So there could be a damaging event today, and it mightn't show up in the groundwater for 10 years. Whereas on the P loss side, it can show up tomorrow if there's if you're getting nutrient and sediment, P and sediment carried directly into water. And rainfall has a huge impact. If you have rain immediately after spreading slurry, and you're close to water, you're at high risk of loss of nutrients. And the advice from Teagasc and all the agencies is that to try and minimize the nutrients and optimize the times that you put everything out, the time that you put out your slurry, the earlier in the year that you can put it out, the more active the grass roots are for taking up nutrients, the more of it will be taken up quickly. So then the less that's available for loss to water. And I suppose that's one of the key messages all the time. And then not to over apply chemical fertilizer, which obviously nobody is trying to do this year, but with the prices. But I think we will learn a lot of lessons from this year in terms of water quality in particular, that farmers can do a lot to manage their nutrients really, really efficiently, and to improve water quality and to improve the money that's in their pockets as well.
Yeah, and I suppose you kind of touched on it there around the very specific localized nature of this, and I suppose look, it's maybe in certain parts of the country it's maybe on a parish scale or certainly on a water body scale that you have maybe more uniformity of land, but and Cathal kind of touched on it as well around the real need for or what maybe you'll provide guidance on this around what's the best way for tackling this. We have the national picture and the national rules, and you're very much kind of saying that maybe we need to focus a little bit more specifically on localized areas, and maybe both Cathal and Mary just to give us your thoughts on that as to what's the best pathway forward potentially, notwithstanding resources and all that, because there's a resourcing issue there as well, but in your own opinion, what would you think might be a way going forward?
Well, I'd hand over to Cathal in a second, but I think that the behavioural work that we're doing with Denis and his team and with ASSAP, and again, I'll compliment the ASSAP programme and Noel for the level of data that's there, and the usefulness of it. That, as Paula said, what we're trying to look at is there are hundreds of measures within ASSAP that are applied differently in different contexts, and this comes back to the whole localised nature of the problem and the solutions. What we're trying to do is to come up with clusters of measures that are kind of highly adaptable, if you want to put it that way, that are maybe low cost, that farmers feel they have the knowledge and the know-how to actually adopt them, that farmers think it's a good thing to do and their neighbours think it's a right thing to do. And that the cost is reasonable. But one of the important things in terms of cost is sometimes people think of just the financial cost. What we're also trying to look at here is, as Paula described them, transaction costs. So it's not just money. If a farmer is asked not to spread slurry on a sloping field that's near a river in bad weather, or not to spread at all, not only is there a financial cost and loss of productivity to that farmer, but there's also a big hassle, nuisance and time cost if he or she has to drive that slurry a couple of miles down the road to an out farmer, someplace where it can be put out safely. So all of that gets factored in, and that's kind of, we're trying to tie all the pieces together to bring those cost elements and the spatial and the localized nature and the behavior together to try and come up with kind of a smaller set of measures that we think could be highly adaptable and with good impact as well. Cathal, maybe you want to come in on that also.
Thanks, Mary. I think water quality is very challenging. If you look at greenhouse gas emissions, it's dependent really on the number of animals you have and the amount of fertilizer you use. It depends on where the farm is. There's very many measures. We saw Paula's work, 300 odd options that are being advised by ASSAP advisors. So very skilled advisors, knowing the local situation, knowing what to do on the farm. The challenge is to take that knowledge and to be able to apply it more widely in other areas. So it is quite significant. Going back to some of Denis's work in terms of their engagement with advisors on the issue. It is quite a significant organisation. I guess that the challenge is responding to all those needs.
We're having some issues with your line there, Cathal. There's breaking up a little bit, but it's fine. I think it's working reasonably well. But could I ask? I mean, are we looking, like, based on all of the work that you presented here, are we looking at the need for a more targeted approach to our advisory efforts across the country, given the fact that there are we need local solutions to local issues, and you know, is your work pointing towards the need for a scaled up version of the ASSAP program beyond the priority action areas?
I think maybe if I take this, because Cahill's line is poor, I think maybe to look at it two ways, Mark. You know, if you had a magic wand and you could have ASSAP advisors all over the country, I think would be fantastic. And already the Noel, how many years is ASSAP on the go? 3, 4?
2018, mid 2018, I suppose.
Okay, yeah. So already in the recent EPA water quality report, they acknowledge the fact that within the priority areas for action where ASSAP is working, and that there seems to be a small positive improvement in water quality. But as I said, one of the problems is lag time. So we don't know how long it takes for these mitigation actions to show up. And ASSAP have had very good levels of engagement with farmers in these areas. Now, these are high risk areas where there's a known issue with water quality. And I don't know if it's feasible. I think it would be great if you could have ASSAP trained advisors all over the country, but there's a significant, from an advisor perspective, there's a significant knowledge jump there to get to the level where all the ASSAP advisors are. What we're trying to do is it's Paula has only started recently working on this in depth within the project, but if we can get to a stage with the behavioural analysis where we can find those measures and we can describe measures and learn from the ASSAP database. So in other words, if I was a non-ASSAP advisor and it was possible for me to have a tool that would say, I go out to Mark Gibson's farm and I say, this farm is in location XY coordinates, wherever it is. And the tool would tell me then that the type of risk that's here is, it's either N or it's P or it's sediment or whatever. The water quality here is, and the status of the water quality and the trends in the water quality are here. And the type of farmer is, it's livestock farmer, medium size, medium stocking rate. And from the ASSAP database, can we learn enough from the database to be able to put forward options for a non-ASSAP advisor, for a general, would say Teagasc or whoever else, private sector advisor, to be able to learn from what ASSAP advisors what they recommended to farmers in this particular context, but also what the level of engagement and uptake of measures was in those particular contexts. So that's where we're trying to get to, and it's a bit of the holy grail at the moment. We've a short time left in the project, and it's kind of going beyond where we promised in the project, but it's the obvious kind of objective at this stage, and that's part of Cahill's kind of work in terms of integrating the cost effectiveness and what we know from all of you things spatial work and Daniel's cost effectiveness work, and Paula's behavioural work now as well, to try and integrate all that together. What can we learn from how ASSAP has operated, both from a farmer perspective and from an advisor perspective, to be able to provide more generalized information that would be useful for general advisors.
So it's a decision support tool for advisors rather than farmers, to be able to translate what the specialist ASSAP advisors know for mainstream advisors.
I see Denis and Daniel are there in the background, and Paula, you think, please feel free to jump in at any stage if you want to make a point. Noel, back to you.
Yeah, just a kind of very specific question around the regulations and the implementation of regulations. And have you observed a disconnect between the implementation of the water quality regulations and an understanding of the same regulations objectives? So water quality being the objective, but from farmers on farms or with advisors assisting farmers with compliance of such regulations. So, are people maybe getting bogged down on maybe the bureaucratic side of it as opposed to seeing the bigger picture and why the regulations are there, which is to protect water quality? And have you observed that in your analysis to date?
That might be one for Denis. I know he has his hand up to come in there.
Hi there, everyone. I actually wanted to come in on the previous point, which is around, it was when Mary was referencing the decision support tool for advisors. I think that's a very good idea, and including the transaction costs would, once you have the criteria for the location, you can then select the lowest transaction costs for that farmer. The more you know about that farmer's situation, and also you can also add in certain behavioral questions to see, how much time they have to do things, what their resources are, and so on. But I think it's also really important to, one of the things that came out in our analyses is there's a marketplace of advisors, and farmers choose advisors. And so it's one of these things to always keep in the back of our minds. I think for advisors, correct me if I'm wrong there, Noel, you kind of contact that in reality, which is when you're providing advice, that your advice, if it doesn't suit the farmer then is going to be thinking, might think twice about going back to your advice service. They might go to another advice service to get the advice that they want. And so there's an interesting role that farmers play as in that marketplace. And if you're going to, when you have private advisors and ASSAP advisors in there providing competing advice, there might be it might be worth talking to the private advisory network in terms of requirements to bring up certain issues, because it might make the advice marketplace unfair, if you get me. So it's one of those things that comes up. There we go. So it might be one of those things that comes up that might be an issue. So it came up in our advisor study.
Yeah, and just maybe just on that, actually, in that flow chart that you had up, Cathal, from the Teagasc to the research and the environment and the flow chart across, and you had the advisories there, but the only one that wasn't connected in the link was the private advisors. And I suppose to me, that is a big gap in what we're trying to achieve. And maybe, have you any thoughts as to how we can engage better and mainstream it more? Because I think mainstreaming is a very important point that you made on the same slide, I think. So obviously we need to, and within our own Teagasc advisors as well, outside of ASSAP, how do we maybe land those messages and get them more ingrained into the advisory discourse, the daily advisory discourse?
I guess that goes back to the overall philosophy of changing the behavior of those who set the incentives. Motivates private sector advisors. Do they have the information flows they need? Are the guidelines there? Often various schemes can inform what private sector advisors will do. So to look at them as a group and to see what they need. So it's, I guess I don't think Denis looked at the private advisors and Rosella in their focus group.
We tried, but we weren't able to get people on board within the time frame, unfortunately.
But this is more just an approach to look at the individual components of the innovation system, including private advisor, but also regulators and civil servants and people in Teagasc and people in universities. We all need to think about what we do and our role in that system. It's not all saying change. we all need to think about how we change to deliver the final outcome.
We're coming close to the end. I have a question. It's a more a general question, and all feel free to contribute to this one. Like earlier this year, we saw the invasion of Ukraine, and suddenly food security came right up the agenda, and that coupled with sustainability, and you have farmers. There are a lot of asks for farmers at the moment. You have biodiversity, you have water quality, you have climate change, and then you have food security as well in the mix as well. Are we? I won't say are we asking too much, but are all of these different asks being properly coordinated, or are we resourcing it enough? I know, Cathal, you talked about the capital constraints and the risk and the time and so forth, but there's a huge amount coming at farmers at the moment, and I'm just wondering: is there enough? Is there enough coordination of that, or is there enough support around all of those? Because if we are serious about wanting high water quality, low carbon food, and a fantastic wildlife and biodiversity, and farmers also obviously making a viable living out of the sector as well, is there enough collaboration happening around all of those different issues?
I might come in on two aspects. I mean, one, there is probably more we can do to have a lower environmental footprint from agriculture, but we have to pay for it. It comes with the cost. There are win-win measures, but they're not all win-wins, and so we need to see how we can do that. If we lose nutrients, there's a cost to the environment and a cost to the farmer. And then more widely, there are so many different goals for our land. Both food security and in terms of various environmental goals. They are not joined up, they're not necessarily coherent, and they're not necessarily all achievable. Very many people have suggested that we need a national land use planning framework or strategy with the information to be able to make, which are hard choices. I mean, there are trade-offs. We may not be able to achieve all the goals we've set, but we have no current framework either to make those. And so we depend a lot on narrative. So I think it's essential that the country develop as soon as possible. And there is planning at the moment, but to roll out that land use planning, to work out what's in the best interest of the country, and then to resource it properly.
Mary, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, just I guess maybe to learn from what we're doing in this project and our learnings from taking an innovation system approach. Our innovation system approach just looked at the water quality component of the agri-environment. But I guess what's needed maybe is an innovation system that takes in water quality, greenhouse gases, biodiversity, land use, landscape, recreation, all of these things. As Cathal said, there are so many demands on the systems from our landscape, that maybe all the people involved in all the different elements need to sit down and look at their own innovation system rather than just look at our individual sections.
Okay,
just
Denis, we're getting tight on time. If you could maybe make it brief.
And you think then that farmers at the very bottom of all of these different responsibilities, and then they've all the different regulations for all the different chemicals, all the different electricity, all the different buildings they need to do. I think we need to work on ways of coordinating all of this.
Yeah.
So there's an onus on that system to really coordinate. Absolutely, couldn't agree more. Look, we're out of time. I want to say thank you to all our presenters: Cathal, Mary, Paula, Denis, and Daniel, and Ting is there in the background as well. Thank you for all of your contribution today. Noel, thanks for helping with questions. And I want to say thanks to Yvonne Maher, who's helping in the background, along with Andy Boland and Pat Murphy in terms of the organization of this series. Next week, we're going to be joined by Rebecca Davis and Molly Burns from Leaf UK, and they'll be discussing linking environment and farming. This is a group that's in the UK, and I think will be a really interesting model for us to look at from an Irish perspective. So until next week, hope you have a nice long weekend, and happy Halloween to everyone. And
Happy Halloween.
we will see you all next Friday at 9:30 again. Thanks again, everybody.
Thanks, Mark.
Bye. 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 Bye.